Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Martha welcomes Peter Elliott to the show. Peter Elliott is a priest of the Anglican Church of Canada. Hailing from the Niagara Region of southern Ontario, his ministry has included leadership within the Anglican Communion for the full inclusion of LGBTQ people and strong advocacy for a spirituality that promotes social and environmental justice. Over his 40-plus years in ordained ministry, Peter has served in senior positions internationally and nationally within the Anglican Church. A longtime resident of Vancouver, British Columbia, Peter was Dean of Christ Church Cathedral and currently is a coach and consultant in private practice. He is a featured writer on arts and culture in the Anglican Journal, the national newspaper of the Anglican Church of Canada, and enjoys working with the Dean of Portland, Oregon, the Very Reverend LeRud, as co-host of the podcast The Gospel and Musical Theater. Peter's husband, Thomas Roach, is an artist working primarily in textiles. Please take a moment to rate and review this episode on whatever podcast platform you're listening on, and if you find it helpful, please share it with a ministry friend. Our mission is to help you and your church walk with faith boldly into the future.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. I am the co-host of Future Christian, Martha Tatarnic. Today, I'm having a conversation with Peter Elliott, a longtime colleague and a mentor to many of us, including me, in the Anglican Church of Canada. Welcome to the podcast, Peter. It's so great to have an opportunity to talk
Martha,
with you.
Hey, Martha. Thanks for the invitation. Happy to hop aboard.
Now, we know each other from way back and all kinds of, various family connections across the Anglican Church and so on and so forth. But many of our listeners certainly don't know you. So we're going to start with some opening questions and give our listeners an opportunity to get to know you a little bit. So, Peter, what was the faith context in which you were raised?
Well, you're in St. Catharines, Ontario. I grew up in St. Catharines, Ontario, born in 1954.
You sure did, right.
And into a family very connected in the life of the church. I guess the deep values of our family were spirituality, music, education, and family. So my mom and dad were both very, very involved at Grace Church St. Catharines. I was born in 54, so I'm a baby boomer, and that part of St. Catharines, which now looks old, down around Geneva Street and so forth, was new suburbs, and Grace Church was a new church, and they were both very involved. My dad had been involved in the Anglican Young People's Association, the AYPA, famous organization in its time, as Dominion president. And so he went, for example, as a youth delegate to the First World Council of Churches in Amsterdam in 1948, heard Karl Barth. And I think from that experience and from his sort of national, international experience as a lay leader, he was a financial executive, got a broad vision of the church, very progressive vision, rooted in spirituality. And so he brought that home with him. My mom's origins, although they met in the Anglican Church, their mothers knew each other when they were pregnant with each other, had veered into evangelical Christianity. And so she was very at home in more of the Plymouth Brethren tradition, although she was a good Anglican through to her dying day. And those influences came in. So our family spent a lot of time in church. I was a boy soprano, and so sang in choirs, studied with Eric Dowling, who was the organist and choir master at your parish, St. George's St. Catherine's, for many years. He was my...
Yeah, we shared a few organists and choir masters who moved around our churches.
So singing, church involvement, that was all very important. And in high school, I got involved with the evangelical movement, the Jesus people. I'm that old. The charismatic renewal movement, and was a bit of a Jesus freak in high school.
I did not know that about you, Peter.
Yeah. And so those influences were also very important. And then I got to university. I was really seeking to get away from God. And I found the more that I read, the more that I wrote, I was thinking theologically. I mean, language I'd put around it now. And so went to seminary. But that's early influences were St. Catherine's, Anglican Church, international progressive Christianity, and the evangelical charismatic renewal movement.
Yeah, those are some really great pillars of influence and context. And you've teed up my next opening question, which is, why don't you tell us a bit about your calling?
Well,
found yourself going to seminary after trying to get away from God.
So my mother, were she here, may she rest in peace, bless her heart, would probably pull out embarrassing photos of me playing church as a kid. Mm-hmm. My grandfather, her dad, built me a pulpit when I was 8 years old. It's still in our house. And so from early years, I had wondered about whether or not God was calling me into the life of the church as a priest and that sort of thing. Late high school, my best friend was killed in a plane crash. Suddenly, he is involved with the Niagara Flying Club, co-piloted small planes. The plane was lost, found no survivors. And so all of a sudden, some of the certainty that I had relied on in my faith, mainly through the evangelical world and some of the charismatic renewal, God was somewhat absent. And that's why I chose to go to a secular university. And I thought I'd be an English teacher or something like that. That was the aspiration I had.
Okay.
But then writing and reading, I studied English literature and philosophy. And that was what really attracted me were theological themes. And God's great trick on me. I went to Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario, thinking it was a really secular university, not knowing that most of the faculty had been recruited from Trinity College in Toronto, and were more Anglican than Anglicans. And so everywhere I turned around, I was bumping into Anglicans. So I thought I'd go to seminary. The bishop at the time was encouraging some of us to go to study in the U.S. And so I went to Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And that was an eye-opening experience. Went thinking I'd study theology, but I really wasn't sure about ordination.
Like maybe get it
out of my system. It looked like it was sort of around. Well, boom, from Ontario into Cambridge, Massachusetts, 1976, the first notice I saw on the bulletin board was a report from the General Convention, which was in Minneapolis in 1976. And the notice simply said, ordination of women approved. And already at EDS, there were two of the women who were ordained in Philadelphia, Carter Hayward and Sue Hyatt, who were on faculty and were regularly presiding in chapel. Irregularly ordained was. So I discovered the feminist movement, discovered what one of my friends referred to as a venerable lesbian and gay community at the school. progressive theology, and did a couple of years at a parish. I worked at Christ Church, Harvard Square, and found out I really kind of loved parish ministry. So with a friend one night over a glass of bourbon, we were sitting reflecting on our lives, and I said, I think I'm in for this ordination thing. I mean, maybe it was no road to Damascus for me. It was no sudden thing. It was kind of an evolving consciousness, a call, I guess.
Yeah, sounds like God had some chess pieces moving against you to sort of get you into that checkmate situation in the best possible way. Yeah, that's lovely. So, what's some change that you have clocked in the Christian context from growing up to now? I mean, I'm guessing there's a lot,
boy.
So maybe pick one thing or
Yeah.
something.
So moving from Cambridge, Massachusetts to Hamilton, Ontario was an enormous culture shock. And I remember I was the curate at the cathedral, the Anglican Cathedral in Hamilton. And one of the things I was asked to do was to help coordinate a service for the Girls' Auxiliary, which used to be this kind of, it was like brownies or guides, but it was an Anglican order for young girls. We were meeting, they all wore uniforms and that sort of stuff. And we were meeting to plan the service, and they said, so we would like to sing the hymn, Sons of God. Now, I came back from EDS deeply committed to inclusive language. Like, that was it. Right. And the idea that you would have a church full of young girls all singing Sons of God was just cognitive dissonance. Like, are you people listening to yourself?
Yeah.
So, but in some ways, I think my time at seminary gave me a sneak preview of what the future was going to be like. And then came into the Anglican Church of Canada, where already women were ordained, but the patriarchy and misogyny was still present, as it still is, by the way. I came back to the Canadian Church just as the Book of Alternative Services was being new liturgies, and there was a huge backlash to that.
New liturgies.
So I came into a changing church. I came in 1980 when I was ordained. The church was already in decline. The decline was subtle,
for sure,
but it was there. And over, good Lord, 44 years now ordained, I've seen the decline accelerate, become precipitous. And when there are articles, as there sometimes are, recently was, that says the decline was caused by progressive values finding their way into the church, I want to call bullshit on that. I don't think it's anything to do with progressive values. I think the causes are deeper. So living through the decline, resisting it, trying to find ways to get out of it. I mean, that's kind of, yeah.
Yep. Those are definitely some overarching themes. And I think that you're absolutely right. I take issue when people like to point to a single thing and say, haha, that was what.
If you hadn't ordained women, if you hadn't changed the King James Version, if you hadn't brought LGBTQ 2S+ queer folks in, I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Okay. What is a spiritual practice that you are finding meaningful now?
I'm not a contemplative. I'm kind of bad on all that, sitting and thinking about God stuff. And I feel badly about that, but, I don't think you can You can't by force of will become a contemplative, in my humble point of view.
I feel like God has room for us non-contemplatives
That's
as
such
well.
a relief, Martha. Thank you.
You know?
Yeah.
I feel like God loves us too. I'm banking on it.
Oh,
I'm
good.
banking.
Me too. Me too. My theologically, my view has become very earth-centered, and so, I mean, I agree when Richard Rohr says that the first incarnation wasn't in Bethlehem. The first incarnation was the Big Bang, when divine energy materialized.
That's
And that's something.
beautiful.
And so every tree,
Yeah.
every plant, every animal, all of life discloses the mystery of God. So we're fortunate enough, my husband and I, to live in Vancouver, right next to the beach, and right next to adjacent to Stanley Park. So we spend a lot of time outside. We in pandemic times we started and it has continued walking through the woods. And so right now we're recording this in late summer. I find my spiritual practice is meditating on a dahlia. A dahlia are these amazing flowers that
Okay.
are they grow taller than me, and I'm 6'2". So they're huge.
Oh my gosh.
I'm holding up my hands. It's a podcast; you can't see it. Some of the blossoms are called dinner plate. They're the size of a dinner plate, and intricately formed. The colors, the symmetry, the sheer beauty of them is astonishing.
Mm-hmm. That sounds pretty contemplative,
good.
Peter.
Well,
I don't know.
It's the closest I'm going to get.
I'm
Good.
sold. Absolutely. Okay, well, I had a couple of specific reasons why I wanted to invite you on our podcast. First of all, you've had a really significant leadership impact on the Anglican Church of Canada. You had a long and well-respected career in leading a flourishing cathedral church in Vancouver. You now continue to have an impact as you offer coaching for people currently on the ground in Christian leadership. And also in semi-retirement, you're continuing to do some new and creative things, including a podcast whose content speaks to me, the Gospel of Musical Theater. So we're going to get into all of those pieces of interest for me and for our listeners, but I think it's really helpful to just start by talking about a few takeaways that you might offer those who are currently in the trenches in Christian leadership from your very full and successful run in parish ministry. What were some of the biggest learning curves for you?
Oh boy. In parish ministry specifically, I was dean of Christ Church Cathedral, Vancouver for 25 years. And now I do sort of popping into parishes from time to time at the bishop's request, helping out here and there. Reading the culture, like in adaptive leadership theory, they talk about what are the artifacts of culture in a congregation. And some of that is are things like furniture, processes of decision making, that sort of thing. Another part are the human documents, the human beings who make up congregations, and the way they have figured out, how to be church in our time. So that's a learning curve. I mean, it just takes years. I followed a number of luminaries at Christ Church Cathedral in Vancouver, Herb O'Driscoll, now of blessed memory, Jim Cruikshank, Michael Ingham, So there was my first rector's warden, 10 years after I started, introduced me to one of her friends as the new dean. So it had this, had a kind of a long memory, and finding a way in wasn't always easy in early days. The early days at the cathedral were hard. I was a bit of a change agent, so that was difficult. But then once I kind of absorbed the culture and became part of it, really, by the end, very much a part of it, maybe too much after 25 years. Then it was like I caught sail. And things clicked. Now, that doesn't mean it was all beer and Skittles, dear Lord. I mean, every day was a new set of problems and conflicts and difficulties and all that sort of stuff. But I get to summarize, reading the culture, knowing the people, and figuring out how I fit in it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that those are some really key ingredients. They all take time, don't they? Like, I mean, 25 years is a real run in parish ministry in one place. I'm 10 years into St. George's, where I currently serve. And yeah, I get that sense of like the wind starting to be in the sails, like when you've put in quite a bit of legwork in terms of just like getting to know where you are and become part of it.
Speaking the language, knowing the characters. There was an article a long time ago from the Alban Institute that the thesis of it was parish ministry begins after 10 years. And the notion was that it takes 10 years to read the culture, to be accepted, to be trusted as someone, who would show up when needed, take care of folks. And that's, because after 10 years, I got itchy feet and thought, it's time to move along somewhere. And then I read that article and thought, oh, I guess I've just begun. So just to your point,
it's a really nice reframe, isn't it?
Just to your point about it taking time. Think about it. I guess a metaphor would be, the time it takes for a good wine to mature.
Yep. I like that. And, it's a good learning. I don't know where you fall in this category, but like, I'm definitely somebody who wants everything done yesterday. Gosh. And so like, I definitely have come into the various parishes I've served with a million ideas that I want to do right away. And I generally get right on it. And like, good ministry needs to sort of grow at the speed of relationship building. And that's pretty slow. And and like, that's not at all a slight against getting things started and trying new things and so on. I mean, I'm a big fan of all of that, but I also just like, it does take time to build that trust and that knowledge. And are there things about parish ministry that are just completely different from what you thought 44 years ago when you were ordained? Like, what are the biggest surprises?
Well, I mean, for me, the biggest surprise was getting involved in parish ministry because, because I'm gay, and in 1980, being openly gay in the life of the church was kind of it was a red mark against you. It was something, scarlet letter, whatever. And so my heroes had always been church bureaucrats. I always thought people who worked for the national church or diocesan folks, that would be a great career. And that was really the career path I was on. I worked for the Diocese of Toronto, coordinating lay education for about 5 years. And then I worked for the National Anglican Church of Canada as senior management and program for 5 years. And it was, and I thought, because there were lots of gay people who hid in church bureaucracy, it was safe.
Okay.
We weren't safe in parishes, because God knows what homosexual people would be up to in parishes. I mean, people's minds. Thank God this has changed so much. It's one of the big changes. Thank God for it.
One of the big changes.
So I was as surprised as anybody when Michael Ingham, who was then the bishop, came calling at the national office, said, "I'm looking for a dean." He'd been elected bishop. And I said, "Okay, Michael, I've been thinking about that. I've got some names for you." Because the job I had, I was responsible for what the Anglican Church of Canada did in Canada, not the international stuff and that sort of thing, but the Canadian mission. And so bishops were quite often in my office looking for clergy because I knew lots of people across the country. I said, I've got some names for you. He said, no, Peter, I'm looking at you. And I said, "Oh, Michael, you got to be out of your mind." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, I've never lived west of Burlington, Ontario. I've never been the rector of a parish, and I'm gay and I'm not called to celibacy." And he said, "Oh, okay, well, just hold on a minute." And we talked those three through. He said, "The cathedral isn't really like a parish. It's more like a program center. And actually your executive skills would be really, really helpful." I said, "Well, I don't want to be spending a lot of time having tea with old ladies and stuff." He said, "No, I don't have to worry about that sort of thing." And we talked about the West, living in Western Canada, on the coast, and around the gay thing. He said, I'll support you as far as I'm able." So I interviewed for the job, got the job. Long story short, to your direct question, by the end of my time, what I ended up loving about parish ministry was sitting with older women and men having tea and talking. Because I learned so much.
So great.
Their faith, their faithfulness, their questions, their capacity to change. There was a beautiful woman at the cathedral. She died probably 20 years ago or so. She was in her late 80s when I arrived. And when she found out Thomas and I were together, she called me and she said, "You're coming over for tea. Both of you." Like that. I said, "Okay." So we went over and had tea. And it was her way of blessing, right? Her way of saying, yeah. And she said, "If ever anybody tells you they're too old to change, introduce them to me."
Oh my gosh. Isn't that amazing?
And so the cathedral I found, and I found in most parishes that I've hung around in, if you talked about being on a quick alert, you want to do things. And gosh, I was that. I want to do everything. I wanted to build a congregation, wanted to add new programs in, all that. Once I slowed down and started listening to folks, I would wonder sometimes when I, approach the altar or the pulpit at the cathedral, what the hell am I doing talking to these people? Presiding. These people. My God, such faithfulness.
I know. And through really hard things, like you understand something about resilience and generosity and how your heart can break and and beautiful things can be done, like grace can come through that heartbreak. The point I just always find kind of overwhelming in worship is when people come up for communion and I know what they're coming up with, I know what they're carrying, and they come so faithfully and they know how God has been with them, they know how their faith has seen them through. It's remarkable. Like,
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a similar thing for me, we, on Good Friday at the cathedral, did veneration of the cross after homily and stuff. And so we bring in a big cross and then invite people to come forward and stand by the cross while the choir sang the reproaches or an anthem and that sort of stuff. And I sat there most every Good Friday and just silently wept, seeing people stand in front of the cross, knowing what they were bringing, just because I knew these folks, um, and amazed at their faithfulness and their, yeah. So, I mean, I know parishes can be frustrating, and good God, pardon my language, there are some real assholes that you encounter in work in the church, and people who didn't like me, which I find impossible to understand why, but
that is impossible.
but people just they weren't we weren't on the same wavelength. That's fine. And people who, especially through some of the sex wars in the mid to late 90s, said horrible, awful things. So I'm not saying that the church is far from a perfect institution, but at the core of a healthy congregation, there is a cohort of people whose faithfulness is overwhelmingly beautiful and who really enriched my life deeply. And many of them continue to be, friends, people we're able to see, and sadly now I've been retired for 5 years. I've gone to too many funerals of folks who were, but that's life. We're only here for a short time.
Yeah, that's right. I think that you've named a few things here, but are there any other ingredients that you would just want to name that help toward happiness and fruitfulness in ministry? Because you're right, the challenges are real. The grace is real, but the challenges are significant. Yeah. The hurt and the heartbreak that goes along with so many aspects of ministry, that can be significant. So, anything else you just want to?
Yeah, it's hard right now, I think, as the future, as we move into the future with the precipitous decline of institutional Christianity, certainly right across North America and Western Europe. It's different experience in Asia, different experience on the African continent, obviously. But with some exceptions, my heart goes out to clergy who are working these days, especially post-pandemic. It's been really hard to get back. And the stresses that brings out around finance. How do you finance the institution? How do you care for aging buildings? I mean, all of those things are very familiar issues from my own practice of ministry. I guess the one thing, Martha, I'd say, and I think you're doing it really well at St. George's, and I see so many other places that are doing it, and I'll say it in an outrageous, provocative way. I don't think you can spend too much money on the music program.
Yeah.
I mean, I facetiously used to say about my time at the cathedral, to my clergy team, and I was fortunate to work with some first-rate clergy over 25 years, and we were always 3 or 4 of us. We think they're coming for our sermons. They're coming for the music.
It's true.
And I think it's profound because I think music speaks to a whole other level of consciousness than our didactic sermons do, right?
Yeah.
And when you look at the mega churches, what they call worship, when I go to a mega church, that is usually about 15 minutes of singing. That's the worship part, and then there's the message, and then there's the commitment part. I mean, so I despair often when I'm in churches at just how bad the music is, and I don't think that's going to help us a bit. We're my background in musical theater as well. I mean, you can put on a great show, but if the music sucks in a musical,
it's you're not gonna
and
win
for
any
Anglicans anyway.
fans.
For Anglicans anyway, I think really for all Christians, Sunday morning is musical theater. The liturgy is musical theater. You break into song all of a sudden in a great moment. People say that never happens. Well, in my life, it happens. I sing
it does
at church. Yeah. We've got costumes on.
Yeah.
There's a script, particularly in more formal traditions like Anglican. There's solos, there's quartets and there's a plot and and I think people respond to that when the musical theater, when the music is of the best we could offer, the best we can offer.
Mm-hmm. Well, and to go back to like an earlier point of yours, which is blaming progressive values for the decline of the institutional church. I mean, I think that there's a much stronger case to be made for secularism being the root of the decline of the institutional church, and that, people have trouble connecting to the transcendent. Well, music is one of the most intuitive and immediate ways to allow that connection, right? To invite people into that connection. So yeah, you can't spend too much money on the music program. I can hear the musical leaders in our audience applauding.
Well, you look at
listening to.
You look at the enormous popularity of Taylor Swift, for example.
Don't get me started about Taylor Swift, because I have a lot of.
I do too. But I mean, her concerts are religious events in a whole. And the music, I mean, people sing along. They know all the songs. They know the script. And on it goes with pop music. And I'm not saying we have to bring pop music into the church. I don't think it's a bad idea. But people's musical tastes are actually quite sophisticated in this postmodern era. Mm-hmm. And when they come to, a church that struggles through some 19th century Victorian hymns badly, I happen to like a lot of 19th century Victorian hymns. I'm that kind of church dweeb, but no wonder they stay away in droves. It's bad.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, we're going to circle back to musical theater in a little bit, but I do want to talk about clergy coaching, because you offer some coaching now. And I'm going to just give a bit of a preamble here, because I think that it's helpful for our listeners to know that I came to you for clergy coaching in 2021, right in the thick of the pandemic, a few years ago now. Yeah. I think for me, there were a few reasons why I felt like this would be a helpful step forward for me in ministry. COVID got me to be honest about some things that maybe I wasn't being completely real about, including some struggle with burnout. There was also just something about all that, like enforced distance of COVID, that highlighted problems in our organizational structure, communication, that kind of thing, that had been easier to just overlook or ignore when we were seeing each other all the time, and that became quite problematic when we weren't in the same building. I think that there were two pieces around our time together in that coaching relationship that made the biggest difference to me in my leadership capacity. The first was just very basically the I've been there too dynamic. That you are somebody who can speak out of your own experience of leadership. You're not candy coating anything. I felt like my struggles were normalized. I felt like there were things that I could open up and name because I didn't feel as isolated in those struggles. So that was just a really big piece of the coaching journey. But then there was also very much some concrete and doable advice that you were able to offer me from a different perspective, different lens, more experience. There were just some small steps and simple adjustments that really did make a difference in helping things to be better. So my first question after all of that preamble
Good to hear. Thanks.
is, what made you want to get into coaching when you retired from full-time?
Right. Well, I guess two things. One is retirement. I mean, and that could be a whole podcast on its own because it's a huge issue and the baby boom, we're all retiring around the same time. So retirement doesn't mean you stop living or stop ministering. And I kind of knew what I didn't want to do. I didn't want to do like long-term interims, filling in. I do a little bit of that, but not a lot. And I've always been interested in clergy development, partly working with so many curates and associates over the years, and as dean in the diocese. I had a fair bit to do with clergy appointments and all that sort of stuff. So curious about that. And I, I enjoyed sitting in the homes of elderly people drinking tea and hearing about their lives. One of the things I did a lot at the cathedral, which I didn't think I was going to do, was being in my office available to people who, and I thought, well, what do I like to do? I like listening to people. I'm fascinated with human beings and what makes them tick. And I had been helped at various levels, various periods over my ministry with coaches, therapists, that sort of thing. So I thought, I could do that. So did a little deep dive into how you do that and got trained. Did training with the Neuro Leadership Institute out of New York, who were really fascinating. They put together kind of brain science and good coaching, and got accredited and all that sort of stuff. That took a couple of years to do all of that. I had to sit an exam, a 3-hour exam. My God.
Wow.
I know I hadn't had an exam for like 45 years, almost 50 years. I hadn't sat in an exam. And then you have your coaching, you record sessions and analyze them and that sort of stuff. So did all of that and found I looked forward, like when your name would pop up in my calendar, I thought, oh, I get to spend an hour with Martha Tatarnic. And we're not going to bullshit. We don't have to talk about the weather or that sort of stuff. We're going to get right into what's going on in her life and ministry, and focus and take some positive steps forward. So in retirement, it seems to me, it's important not to just do nothing. I didn't want to do nothing. I wanted to do something. And I found this really, and continue to find this absolutely enlivening and energizing and educational. I learned so much from my coaching clients all the time.
Well, that's probably what makes you a good coach, is that willingness to not just offer your own expertise, but also to be a fellow disciple,
fellow traveler,
a fellow student. Yeah. So I feel like we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but what would you say are like the common pressure points across ministry as you listen to people like me?
Yeah. Well, and you are in a unique and privileged situation where you have a large congregation of clergy colleagues that work with you, diverse. A lot of my clients are in small, struggling congregations. Um, they are the only priest there, and it's just lonely, right? And so I think one of the things that makes coaching valuable for folks is the opportunity to have a serious, full and frank conversation with somebody about exactly what's going on, be heard, be seen, and to think through what you want. The other is, and I sure know this from my own experience, people people have no idea. Like, I think I love lay people, and we've talked about how wonderful they are. I don't think a lot of members of a congregation know what is really involved in being a parish priest. I think they think it's really about Sundays, and writing a sermon. And, that must take so much time. Well, holy cow, I know, I think the clergy who are listening know. Um, yeah, you spend a fair bit of time. The sermon is always with you. That's not that's the fun part of the job. That's where you get to be a theologian, biblical interpreter, cultural interpreter, all that sort of stuff. I love that part. It's the budgets, it's the building, it's the conflicts that happen inevitably in human community. It's your own self-doubt, it's imposter syndrome, it's all of that stuff that pops up. And here's my point. It's really easy to lose focus on, so what is it that I'm wanting to have happen here? What's my goal? What's my vision for the work? Yeah. So what the feedback I get from my coaching clients is, and you went through the process as well, that whole first process of identifying three goals to kind of focus on. I had one client who said, if you had done nothing else with me but that was worth it, because it focused my mind. Okay, so I've got like these three buckets of things that I'm working at. Here's my vision of where we could go, and then helps me think through the planning steps and navigate the inevitable twists and turns in the journey to get there. And I think it's lacking. Nobody else, just speaking within the Anglican system, and I know people listening come from other systems, but the church beyond the parish, there's not a lot of help for clergy, particularly who are on their own in ministry settings, to say, okay, I know you want to serve the congregation. What is it? What's your vision of where this congregation parish should be going? And how do you imagine getting there? So,
yeah, and that agency part is like really easy to lose track of. It is so easy just to become somebody who reacts and who is just sort of constantly responding to the things that come up, right? It is difficult often when you're in the thick of things to be able to take a step back and say, okay, like what am I discerning my choices are here? Like, what am I bringing to the table?
Yeah, there's a little diagram. I probably shared it with you when we were doing our coaching journey from the Neuro Leadership Institute from NLI, that has these 5 things in order: vision, planning, detail, problem, and drama. And most of the time for clergy, we begin with the drama. Right? Yeah. Somebody is not speaking to somebody else, or, somebody didn't lock the church, or name your drama. They're everyday bloody dramas in the congregation. And so, what most of us are trained to do, I got a drama. So you bring people together, you sit down and say, well, we've had this drama. There's got to be a problem here. Let's start it. How can we fix the problem? And then you get into some detail about what the problem is. And okay, so that's what the problem is. So what are we going to do differently? And so you can develop a plan. And often in the midst of all that, someone will say, but what is it we're trying to do in the first place? The vision. In other words, starting with vision, what is it we want to do? What's the plan? Okay, let's detail that out. Then moving toward it, there's going to be problems along and drama. We can deal with those and we can keep going back to the vision. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's extremely helpful. I have to admit, like when I first signed up for our coaching contract together, I was a little worried that it was gonna feel too big, like that we would start kind of digging into organizational structure and start digging into things that needed to be improved or whatever, and that I would end up feeling paralyzed by how much needed to change. Right. And, I think that can be like a reason why people fear change, to be honest, because like what if it's just too much? What if it's like everything? I feel like you were great about being able to identify each time that we met, like one or two bite-sized concrete actionables, exactly. Right? And, maybe this is wishful thinking for our listeners. We usually don't subscribe to the idea that there's actually magic bullets in ministry, but are there any like just little tweaks that sort of generally work for people across the people that you talk to? Like, are there one or two like just kind of bite-sized changes that tend to make a big difference?
I mean, we've all gotten used to the Ed Friedman phrase about non-anxious presence, that's what good leadership involves. And I think sometimes in ministry, it felt to me like everybody was trying to get me anxious about something else. There's not enough, you're not spending enough money on the building, and why aren't we doing more about the poor people who are coming to our door, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I think a key is breathing, like not inhaling all of the anxiety that is kind of the energy. I mean, anxiety is one way to look at it, institutional anxiety. The other is that's part of where the energy is bubbling up from. And taking a deep breath and remembering focus and goals, and then treating people, giving people some space, but also calling bullshit if that's what you're getting.
Mm-hmm.
And then loving the people. I mean, I think that's the other. And most clergy, there are some clergy who genuinely don't like people, and I wonder what the hell they're doing in the job. Because it's people-oriented, it's a people-oriented business. And, but yeah, finding ways to love them. That sounds facile. I don't mean it to be.
Oh, no, I don't think so. I think that, I think people will connect to those two pieces. And obviously, like, to do a coaching contract with you or with somebody does get into the particulars of the ministry context. But I think that those are just a few broad brush strokes that sort of are good reminders,
cool.
Love and breathing.
Love and breathing. Yeah. That sounds like a title of a book, doesn't it?
It sounds like kind of maybe that's something you should think about, Peter. Love and breathing. Okay, let's close with some conversation about this fun project that you're working on right now, a podcast with Nathan LeRud, The Gospel of Musical Theater. I think that we can both say that we're people who get a lot out of musical theater. I grew up on a steady diet of musical theater.
We'll have to have you on our podcast.
It's a huge part. Yeah, I have thoughts. It's it was definitely a big part of my formation. So you've said that it's pretty important to you and your life and spirituality, music in general, musical theater specifically. What do people need to know about the gospel of musical theater in this fun podcast?
Wow. So a while ago, about maybe 10 years ago, I guess now, when we got a new car, it had satellite radio in it, and I became a subscriber to satellite radio and began to listen to, there's a Broadway channel on satellite radio. It's all Broadway all the time. When I first started listening to it, every Monday was Merman Monday. It was all Ethel Merman all the time. And it helped me.
That sounds like a lot.
Oh, you can't have too much. Do you know that Ethel Merman was an Episcopalian? She went to church every Sunday at St. Bart's Park Avenue in New York, and sang the hymns. So it was kind of the releasing of my inner musical theater queen, really, and I began to listen more and more when I was driving or that sort of stuff, to the golden age of Broadway shows and also new shows. And I just realized I really love this stuff, and was invited to teach a course at Conference Center, the Sorrento Center, which you know in the BC's interior. And I taught there a lot, taught courses on the Gospel of John and the Eucharist and René Girard and all that sort of stuff. And they said, what do you want to do? And we were actually in Hawaii, and I thought, what if you looked at musical theater as a way for the gospel to be interpreted? And so my mind started going that way. Nathan, who's the dean of the cathedral in Detroit, was coming. I invited him to preach at the cathedral here in Vancouver. Met him at the airport. We went out for lunch and caught up on news. He said, what are you doing? And so one of the things I'm doing is sort of think about this course called the Gospel of Musical Theater. I don't know what I'm going to do. But he said, oh, then we went out for dinner and we ordered drinks. And he said, what shows are you thinking of covering? And I said, well, of course, we'd begin with Rodgers and Hammerstein, probably Oklahoma, and work our way through. That began a conversation that was 2019 that we haven't stopped having. Yeah, he ended up co-teaching the course with me at Sorrento. He's also a musical theater queen. In fact, the tagline of gospel musical theater is Cathedral Deans and Musical Theater Queens, Nathan LeRud and Peter Elliott. So we are very out as queer gay men who love musical theater. And so we take a show like, we've just done this a number of times. We've seven seasons of our podcast are available anywhere you get your podcast, Gospel Musical Theater. Take a show like My Fair Lady, and begin to tease apart what's going on there and look at the gender politics of it. Look at where gospel comes, the transformation of Eliza, but also what a horrible, horrible, horrible person Henry Higgins is. We were the first time we taught at Sorrento, we trashed My Fair Lady in terms of its gender politics, and there was this lovely woman from the interior who was sitting in the front row and hanging on our every word, and she burst into tears. She said, "I love that show, and you guys have just wrecked it for me." But we look at Oklahoma, for example, which has to do, there's not an indigenous person in the musical Oklahoma. Yet Oklahoma was where all the many indigenous tribes, nations were put. It's a paean to statehood and really to white supremacy. We look at South Pacific and its absolute clarity about the need to end racial discrimination. We look at the King and I and talk about colonialism. So Nathan and I began this conversation, which we continue to have. In the pandemic, we offered the course at Sorrento, just before the pandemic at Sorrento, then in summer school at VST, and then the George Floyd Black Lives Matter thing that happened. And Nathan called and said, we need to do another version of this called Gospel Musical Theater, Race and Redemption. So we taught that at Vancouver School of Theology and at Trinity Cathedral in Portland and at Sorrento Center. And that's become part of the analysis that we bring to musical theater. So it's gospel, but, like Frederick Buechner says, the gospel has to be bad news before it's good news. So we also look at the way musical theater reveals the injustices and oppressions of our time and how gospel can speak into that.
Wow. Wow. So we can find all 7 seasons wherever we get our podcasts. That sounds fantastic. I do have to just say, so we did Oklahoma in my high school, and we had such a forward-thinking drama teacher that she actually found a way of incorporating a kind of an introduction to the musical that framed the Indigenous reality of and that was in the 90s in rural Ontario. I just Nancy Lilleman, I'm not sure where she is now, but she deserves real props for finding a way of highlighting that in rural Ontario in
Bless her heart.
90s through musical
it
theater.
Gave me goosebumps, right? When you were talking about it. I mean, I think one of the things Nathan and I say is we approach a show like in Oklahoma or My Fair Lady or whatever, or Urinetown or Hamilton or the Barbie movie, even as preachers would approach a biblical text, right?
Yeah,
it's a text. It's there. It has a particular origin, but its interpretation is always evolving, and it provides the opportunity for commentary, for thoughtful reflection, and so we use our skills as exegetes, people who do exegesis. We exegete the text and particularly the songs of a show. And so, like Oklahoma, there was a recent revival on Broadway that did what your teacher did in high school, and really played up the whole notion of gun violence, so that the conclusion of Oklahoma. I mean, it's such a weird show in so many ways, but at the heart of it is this Judd figure, right? This outsider who is, scapegoated by the community. All of the sexuality that is kind of hidden over gets focused on Judd. It's a fight at the end. It's a knife wound, or is it a gun wound? And so the set of this reinterpretation of Oklahoma is the back of the stage is filled with guns, and at the finale, the cast comes out covered in blood. Right?
Gosh.
So all of a sudden, Oklahoma goes from being this sunny thing. I mean, when you're curly, when you're a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, hunky cowboy, everything's going your way. You're a boy in the West.
Oh, what a beautiful
Everything's going my way. Yeah. On it goes.
Okay. Well, that is definitely something that I want to check out as soon as possible, and I hope our listeners will as well. We're going to take a quick break and come back for some closing rapid fire questions. So stick with us, and we'll close out in a few minutes. Welcome back to the Future Christian podcast. I continue to be here with Peter Elliott, and we're going to close our show with some rapid fire questions. So, Peter, are you ready? Now, we always do tell our guests that you can take these as seriously or not as you want. Okay, so no pressure. But if you were Pope for a day, what would that daily
Well, if I
life?
were Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, the only Pope, well, let's talk about him. There are other popes. I would ordain women. I would let clergy get married, and I would make a statement that affirms the presence in the church, the gifts and skills of lesbian, gay, transgender, and bisexual members of the body of Christ.
Okay, so that sounds like a full and productive first day. You're not going to wait
Nope,
10 years.
just do it right away. Pope can do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. What theologian or historical Christian figure would you want to meet, bring back to life, have supper with, grab a beer with?
So I'm a Gospel of John geek, like complete nerd. I would like to meet the author or the group of authors who pull together this remarkable, weird text that finds its way into our New Testaments and is read reverently in churches around the world.
That's a good answer. Okay. I have to say as an aside, I had Elizabeth Schrader Pulitzer on the podcast earlier this summer talking about her pretty groundbreaking research into the Gospel of John.
Yeah. And I still like Martha, even if Martha is really Mary.
I agree.
What a name.
Wholeheartedly. I know. Exactly. Okay. What will history remember from our current time and place?
I'm hoping history will remember this was a time in history when the United States of America elected the first African American South Asian woman as president of the United States. That's my hope.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So I just got some chills listening to you say that, because by the time this podcast airs, we'll know.
I know.
Right? So like the people who are listening to this podcast in the future, like they will know whether that hope came to fruition or not.
I preached on this past Sunday, which was just after the Democratic Convention. And the first two sentences of my sermon were pretty much what I said about the hope that I feel seeing around gender, around race, around all sorts of things, around progressive values. Just two sentences at the beginning of the sermon. And then I preached for 20 minutes on the John 6 ending the discourse of bread of life. So the warden got an irate letter saying, "How dare Elliott use the pulpit for politics?" And he should apologize to the whole Church of England because this woman wants to cancel Christmas. And the warden, I'm just filling in this church, wrote and said, "What should I do with this?" And I said, "Absolutely nothing."
Yeah, I think that's fair advice. She wants to cancel Christmas. Oh, goodness. What are your hopes for the future of Christianity?
You know, I'm part of a commission that in the Anglican Church of Canada looking at the future. And we were, there's about 10 of us. I'm the old guy on it. Most everybody is a generation or so younger than me. And we were meeting in Montreal, went to the cathedral for a noonday Eucharist. And there were like 15 people there in this big building. And we came back after and were reflecting on that and thought that's kind of a symbol of where the church is, you know, small gathered communities in spaces that are too big for us. And one of our members said, you know, you put 15 people in a old cathedral and it feels empty. Bring 15 people around my dining room table and it's a crowd.
Yeah.
And that's I think the future of Christianity is, I don't know, who am I, but there's always going to be ways for followers of Jesus to meet around a table with the scriptures, a cup of wine, and a plate of bread, and say their prayers and tell the story and remember that Christ is with them and seek to serve the world. That's my hope that's my hope, is that continues. And I believe that will continue. I have absolute confidence that that'll continue. The institutional forms are going to slide away. Lots of them. I hope some are retained because I love the aesthetic. It speaks to me. But there's always going to be Christians who meet around bread, wine, and scripture and want to serve the world.
Yeah. Yeah. That sounds hopeful and, like something beyond optimistic. It sounds like we can really trust in that.
Yep.
Where can people find more about you, Peter?
I've been meaning to get a website up forever, and I haven't. If you Google Peter Elliott Priest, you'll find a Wikipedia page, and there'll probably be lots of links to sermons and things I've written in the Anglican Journal and articles here and there. Or you can just go to the podcast.
Go to the podcast. What about coaching?
No, I don't have a website. I don't have anything like that. Contact Martha, and Martha can give you, if people contact you through this podcast, you can give them my contact information. I started to develop a website, and I ran out of time because I was getting so many coaching clients. And then, so all my referrals are word of mouth. And
okay.
Send me an email.
All right. Well, you heard it here on this podcast. Word of mouth continues. Thank you so much for your time today, Peter. Thank you for this, I think, fairly wide-reaching conversation and lots of different fun and insightful elements to it. I'm really grateful for your time.
You're welcome.
We always end with a word of peace. So, Peter, may the peace of God be with you.
And you too, Martha. Thanks for the invitation. Always a joy to talk to you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Lauren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.